It blows me away the amount of people in this industry, all the different vendors that are involved, all the people making tons of money. There is tons and tons and tons of money in this industry.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.
What is up, everybody? I am Jason Trost, the host of the Business of Betting podcast. Today is episode 224. I got my coffee. We're going to try another office hours. So I got some questions teed up. We're going to give this format another go. We got some positive feedback on the last format. So basically, if you haven't listened to that before, instead of me having a guest, we have a few questions to tee up, which we've done ourselves to try to get this thing going. But we'd love it if you guys send in your own questions, either on Twitter or over email. And in the show notes, we'll link to where you can get in touch with us. So what's going on? So I just got back from Vegas about a week ago, and a few comments. One, in Vegas, it's just, you kind of take it for granted when you live in the United States, but the quality of the sun is absolutely amazing. The light and the blue skies, and it was very hot, but I really, really appreciated the fact that you had such a beautiful sun in the desert, and it's really stunning. I went to a Cirque du Soleil show, I think it's my third or fourth Cirque du Soleil show. And I kind of went into it with high expectations because everything was great. And the thing that it just, being in the show, it even blew me away with high expectations. Just the danger of them jumping off stage and running and fighting. And I loved it. It was fantastic. I stayed at the Flamingo, which is on the Strip, and had a really nice time in Vegas. Usually I don't like Vegas too much. It's a little bit too much, like too many people, too many drunk people walking about. But this time it was quite enjoyable at the conference, and I had a lot of really nice conversations at the conference too. So that was great. But back in London, the jet lag has smacked me in the face, and it's taken me probably a good week to kind of get back to normal. I think I had my first night of good sleep last night. So that's always a bummer. 8 hours of time difference between London and Las Vegas. So yeah, my kids are excited about Halloween. And I remember when I was a kid, I had my parents stay up all night. Well, my mom and my grandfather helped me with this costume where they created a sofa chair around me. And it looked like I was an old man in a sofa reading a newspaper, and I had these fake legs hanging down. And it was such a great costume. I used to love building my own costume, largely thanks to my mother and my grandfather putting in the extra effort. But it's fun to see my kids exciting about Halloween, another American export that we have gifted to the world. So you're welcome. All right, well, let's kick off with the questions. As I said before, please send in your questions. I'd love to get these to be more interactive, but let's kick it off and see how it goes. Coffee's ready. Jason's ready. The first topic is quite new as of this week and is unfolding in real time. A report in The Guardian this week revealed the UK Treasury is reportedly considering proposals to raise up to £3 billion through increased gambling duties in an effort to address a £22 billion shortfall in the public finances. It calls for doubling of the general betting duty from 15% to 30% and raising the remote gaming duty on online operators from 21% to 50%. News of this immediately sent listed operator shares downwards, with Flutter falling 7% and Entain falling 13%. Flutter CEO Peter Jackson has publicly stated his opposition to the tax, suggesting that increasing taxes on online gambling will harm smaller operators and push consumers towards the black market. What is my take as a licensed UK operator running Smarkets? I'm starting to feel bad for the UK. It's kind of in a weak economic position. The country has lots of brain drain, which doesn't get talked a lot very much, but a lot of really smart Brits end up moving to the United States and sometimes Canada because you can make, for the similar amount of work, you can make a lot more money in the United States. So the UK is brain drain. They really screwed up with Brexit. That was a very monumental case of self-harm that the country did to itself, and obviously removing itself from its largest, nearest trading partner and increasing the barriers to trade is not good for any economy. it's also suffering, it doesn't have the benefit of the United States being on the global currency. So the pound is certainly not by any means a global currency. So they don't have a lot of flexibility in terms of what they can do with the funding like that. So things are not very rosy in the UK. They're kind of gloomy right now. So I totally sympathize that the Labor has a tall order to try to restore confidence, get fiscal balance back, get growth back, not spend too much money. So they're in kind of a rough spot. And I think because of the harm that Brexit has done and some of these other things I mentioned, that it's going to be kind of a long road before things kind of get back to normal. Now, in terms of going after the gambling industry, I'm sure it's a very easy thing to say because, it's easy to sort of beat up on gambling companies. Unsurprisingly, I think it's not a great idea. For those of you that don't know, gambling companies in most cases have to pay tax on addition to corporate tax. So, very, very, I'm sure there's other industries that have to go through this off the top, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. So as a normal company, you make profits. Profits are taxed at the corporate tax rate. I think it's 25% now in the UK. It could be off by a few percentage points. And that rate fluctuates. But on top of that, gambling companies have to pay a rate on their winnings that they make from gambling income. And that's usually pre-profit. So, it's on your what's called your GGR, your gross gaming revenue. So we have to pay 15%. In our case, because we're an exchange, we pay 15% of our commission, and they want to double it. Generally speaking, it's okay I'm in favor of regulation. I'm in favor of taxation. I think taxation should be appropriate. But 15% feels about right to me. It feels like the right balance between making some money off of gambling companies, but also letting free enterprise go. And 30% feels very stiff. The other thing that I would highlight is there's a lot of illegal sports betting and casino operators operating around the world that are not paying taxes, that are not regulated. And so the problem with going after regulated onshore companies is that you create a financial incentive for unregulated offshore companies. I would feel less strongly about this argument if the UK did anything about prosecuting offshore operators, which they do not, as far as I know. I can't think of any instance where they've gone after offshore operators for not paying taxes or not being regulated or money laundering or any of these kinds of things, but they don't. And because of that, beating up on compliant onshore good faith operators, it's a little bit unfair. And I think it's a kind of a bad place to go after it. I understand the need to raise taxes, but I think the industry already pays, I don't know what the total number is, but I think the industry, not only pays corporate tax, but it pays this gambling tax, and it's already fairly taxed, so if you can leave a comment, I would love to see where other industries have sort of an industry tax. I can't think of any off the top of my head. Like I said, I'm sure there are, but it's quite a unique scenario that there's an industry tax. Question number 2. We recently had Dean from Profit X on the podcast. Check it out if you haven't listened to it yet. The main focus of the discussion was Profit's pivot from a pure betting exchange in New Jersey to a sweepstakes model that allows it to operate around 40 states. Sweepstakes model was probably the dominant theme coming out of the G2E conference in Vegas last week, with a lot of hot takes coming out this week, both in favor and opposition. The tribes in California have declared war on sweepstakes, while a number of sweepstakes operators have united to form a trade association called the Social and Promotional Gaming Association. My hot take is it feels like too good to be true. So basically, you had the repeal of PASPA in 2018. Now you have, 20 or so states that offer some form of legal sports betting. And you have this notion, this framework called sweepstakes, very similar to the Monopoly game at McDonald's and other sweepstakes that people know, not from a sports betting context or a casino context, but basically people have figured out how to shoehorn a sports betting operation or a casino operation into this sort of Monopoly sweepstakes game mechanic. And the outcome is they don't have to pay any sort of gambling tax, which we just talked about. They don't have to do any regulation. There's no money laundering. There's regulation. There's no responsible gambling. There's no federal excise duty on the stake. And so I think the number that's been quoted is like 44 states have a legal framework for facilitating these sweepstakes. So from a guy that sort of spent the last 15 years talking to regulators and trying to do the right thing, the right way, going through the front door, to feel like you can just sort of sidestep it with a little bit of hand waviness to jump into this very poorly defined sweepstakes mechanism. It feels too good to be true. It feels wrong. It feels like it doesn't belong there. It feels like it's going to get clamped down. So far, I've heard some critiques on it. We'll have to see what happens. I can't see how the regulators wouldn't change the laws on this, but who knows? I mean, every state moves at its own pace. Every state has its own lobbies. And, as we talked with Bill about political factions, some people might be for this, some people might be against this, and it sort of depends on the local politics since this is a state issue and it's still done on the state issue. So I don't know. I'm myself trying to learn more about it because it's very, very buzzy. It was sort of that and micro betting, I think, or micro data was kind of the theme of G2E. And I mean, it's going to be around and we haven't quite figured out what's going to happen with that. But I'm watching with interest and we'll see what happens. But my take on it is it feels like too good to be true. It feels like it's not viable, but I could be wrong on that. Question number 3, speaking of the G2E conference, which I attended last week, as I said, I was in SBC Summit and I did a podcast from SBC in Lisbon and I did a podcast from G2E, so you can get a flavor of both of those. I got to catch up with industry people and listen to lots of discussions. These events are always a good opportunity to take a pulse check where the industry is and capture the sentiment. Beyond the aforementioned sweepstakes, what are my takeaways? The industry feels, I wouldn't say frothy because it doesn't feel exaggerated, but the mood is quite optimistic. It blows me away the amount of people in this industry, all the different vendors that are involved, all the people making tons of money. There is tons and tons and tons of money in this industry. And the vibe is pretty optimistic. Markets are opening up, things are getting regulated. People have found, the ones that don't want to be regulated, people have found ways around that, whether it's crypto or sweepstakes or this DFS kind of loophole. So things are pretty optimistic and buoyant. And I would say it's not too, like I said, frothy because people are making real money. Like some of these companies are making $1 billion plus profits per year, profits after, not paying gambling tax and doing the regulation. But still, some of these companies are making serious money. So that was one of my big takeaways. Another takeaway is that there is, besides sort of, I guess you might call it regulatory arbitrage, I think is a very fun way to say we're not going to follow the law. Besides doing some of these loopholes, it feels like there's very little innovation. So I get excited about that because that's kind of what I like to think about product design. If you've listened to this podcast before, I'm all about price. Very, very, very few people in the industry give a shit about price or think it's important or want to change it. So I also, not only is there tons of money, but very few people care about giving the consumer low margin sports betting or low margin gambling. And that gets me really excited because it's sort of like huge market, lots of customers, big opportunity there. I would say a similar industry is healthcare. Healthcare is something that we all need. We all spend thousands of dollars on per year, whether it's the government paying or we pay privately, as is the case in the United States. And it's massively expensive and it goes up faster than inflation, at least in the United States. And, just huge opportunity, or education's another example. So you have this gambling industry, betting industry that keeps growing. Margins are arguably going up over time, and it just creates this big amount of opportunity. So I get very excited about that. I'd like to see the industry rationalize, but I think we're still a little ways around that. I think sports data is crazy. The way the leagues are charging a lot of people for official data, and then the data providers sort of try to pass that on to they don't try to pass it. They do pass that on to the operators. And the data is going to be more and more important, and it needs to be cheaper and better quality. And I'm not sure how that's going to shake out. And then I'm also always interested in, it totally makes sense, but there's a lot of sort of adjacent vendors that are at these things, like payment providers, marketing companies and stuff like that. It's a huge ecosystem. So G2E was massive. SBC Lisbon was massive. If you went to SBC Lisbon, it took probably 10, 15 minutes to walk from one end of the conference to the other. G2E is probably similar. So you can imagine if you're walking for 15 minutes in these conferences, you're passing a lot of businesses. And these stands are not cheap. So when I'm blanking on the numbers, but we had a booth in ICE in 2014, something like that. And I want to say we spent 5 figures on the booth, renting the booth, getting the booth built, because these booths can be quite expensive. So let's say we spent $10,000 to rent the space and $10,000 to build the booth, which is probably about as cheap as you can go. But these companies spend $500 million just on the construction of the booth for 4 days, least of which flying all the people out there, staffing the thing, whatever giveaways that they're giving, the free coffee and events, and as well as renting the space from the conference providers. So these things, like, there's tons of money in the business of conferences as well. I had a great time. I met some old friends. I met some current investors. I met some new investors. I met some other startup founders, and it's just a nice place to kind of bring everybody together. I grew up in the suburbs in Connecticut, and one of the favorite things to do in the early 90s is go to the mall. And my wife and I talk about this idea of, the mall is my kind of happy place. She grew up in Paris, so her happy place is walking around small European city streets. But my happy place, for that childhood coding experience was Crystal Mall in Waterford, Connecticut. And I love just going to malls and I don't want to shop. I just want to be in historically, this was church for a lot of people. And I didn't grow up in a religious household, so I never had a church experience. And there's a lot of things I hate about Vegas, but part of what I love about Vegas is in many cases, it's a giant fucking mall. Like, it's a mall for places to go. And the Venetian has the Venice canals, which is kind of a offensive reproduction of something beautiful that's been built up over 500 years or 1,000 years. But it's like a mall with a theme, and my suburban heart and brain just loves it. And I love just walking around the halls of the Venetian. Even something like, Planet Hollywood, which has kind of that facsimile of the sky, it's just sort of, there's something that feels good. I walked around the Caesars Forum as well, and that was huge. The Caesars Forum. I kind of thought it was like that little part in the beginning and just keeps going and going. All right, next question. A new report released last week attempts to measure and quantify the abuse that NCAA athletes are receiving on social media, with angry bettors being cited as key driver behind the increase of abuse. This has led to NCAA contemplating the idea of pushing to ban player prop markets on NCAA games. But some have said that this is more of a social media and societal issue than it is a betting issue. What do I make of all this? Not crazy strong opinions, but generally speaking, I think social media has, on balance, been horrible for society. I think one of the benefits of social media, at least in its more pure forms, is you let micro communities meet each other and connect. So, if you're a gay kid in the middle of Idaho, you can talk to other gays and form a bond where you might be the only gay in the village there. So I think there's cases where social media is quite nice, where if you like doing model airplanes, or any kind of niche hobby or interest or group, that like social media is great for that. But I think social media has turned into a fuel to make everybody angry, to go online, to engage them, to click everything. So I don't think we should ban social media, but I think there should be more outcry that this shit is really, really bad for our brains. It's bad for society. Everybody's angry. It hijacks everybody's dopamine. The political discourse in the United States and in the UK, I think Brexit happened in large part because of social media and Boris Johnson playing the role of the angry person, blaming others for their own problems. It's a societal ill, and we don't talk about enough. We spend so much time talking about gambling addiction and responsible gambling, and which is all important, of course, but like, what about social media addiction? Like, there's no limits on social media addiction. If somebody spends 12 hours on Facebook or 12 hours on Instagram a day, they're a power customer. They're not considered somebody at risk that Facebook does anything about. So I think there's a broader issue here where social media sucks. Society should be regulating this stuff to make sure that it's not getting abused, which it is. It's basically an unregulated medium that is hijacking our brains. We're not wired for this stuff. And, one of the cheapest ways to engage somebody is to make them angry. And the computer algorithms have figured this out. If I want to make sure somebody pays attention to me, I just have to say something bad about them. And the human reflex is so fight or flight. Your body just gets engaged, your cortisol levels go up, and you feel like you have to say something, which gives more eyeballs, which funds the advertisement, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, there's a broader societal issue with social media that I think has nothing to do with the NCAA. Now, the NCAA, I don't have a lot of sympathy for this organization because for years and years and years, and it's slowly starting to change, It's basically a mafia or a cartel that monetize free labor in incredible ways. Quick anecdote, my main sport was wrestling, and I went to Dan Gable, if you know wrestling, he's a super famous wrestler within the wrestling community. He's one of my heroes that I look up to. And I went to his camp, and he had Iowa wrestlers who were working the summer camp. And basically, the Iowa wrestlers who are on scholarship, and a lot of athletes in the United States are on what's called scholarship, where basically by participating in the sport, they get free education. And the terms of their scholarship said that they weren't allowed to have a job because it was sort of considered, I guess, that if they had a scholarship, that was enough money that they had. And so these guys, a lot of people are not from well-off backgrounds with parents that have money to throw at these people. And so these wrestlers were going around selling T-shirts in cash just to make an extra buck, as any college kid wants to do. And they had to do it with cash because they weren't allowed to have a separate job, which blew my mind. So the NCAA has all these crazy rules. In the meantime, wrestling's not what's called a revenue sport. The serious money in the United States is made in basketball and football, and we're talking serious money. So my university was called Northwestern. It's part of the Big Ten. It's one of the big conferences in the United States. And this might be a few years old, but my university got paid $60 million a year just for the TV contract, like $60 million a year. It's crazy amount of money for a school that had, oh my God, I would say 8,000 undergraduate students, just by virtue of the fact that we were part of this network that had a decent TV size audience. And with the expansion of the Big Ten, that number is going to go up and up and up. Crazy amounts of money. And all these athletes are working for free. That's starting to change slowly. There's a recent ruling that athletes can sell their likeness and monetize themselves that way. So it's changing. In terms of player prop, anytime people want to ban gambling, I guess I get really twitchy. Gambling usually isn't the problem. There's a problem in a different part of the stack, whether it's people abusing, if there's real abuse, that's more of the problem than necessarily the sports betting. Also, anytime you sort of ban something, just like the prohibition in the 30s, it goes offshore, it gets illegal. None of the offshore Caribbean sports books and Central American sports books that are still making billions of dollars a year offering sports bets to Americans seemingly without consequence. They don't have to abide by any of these things. So I'm against it getting banned. I think social media is the problem, not sports betting. If people are being abusive, they should follow under the abusive laws. And it's just banning things is not the answer here. Anyway, last question. On the previous office hour episode of the pod, I discussed U.S. presidential betting markets, as Kalshi has just been ordered to stop offering election markets. Since then, they have resumed trading. The judge gave them permission to start trading, and money's been flying on Kalshi, PolyMarket. Interestingly, both of these platforms currently show Trump as a favorite, whereas more traditional polls have them as a coin flip traditionally. This brings an interesting discussion about why the prediction markets are more accurate gauge than polling. There's also been some speculation that Republican voters have been backing Trump in the prediction markets to artificially inflate the perceived chance of him winning, which of course can be gamed much easier than the polls. Okay, there's a lot there. So basically, a poll is trying to guess a poll isn't trying to guess. A poll is going out to the populations, trying to model the population and say, are you going to vote for candidate X or candidate Y? And so when the people say the polls are 50-50, they're talking about the voting share. It doesn't mean that necessarily it's a 50-50 chance of candidate A or candidate B winning. It's trying to, and in the case of the United States, it's a lot harder to model because unlike most countries, we have a state electoral college system. And so there's really 6 or 7 key states, and who wins those 6 or 7 states is going to decide the election. It's not the overall voting. So most of the time when people are citing polls, they're citing the national poll, and you can make some inference on the candidate's strength based on the national poll. But the more important thing in the United States context is the state poll. I think most national polls have Kamala up between 2% and 4%. Like I said on a recent podcast, she needs to be up, based on conventional voting, she needs to be up around 3 to 4% in national polls for her to win the Electoral College. That might change because I think there's kind of a rebalancing of the American political parties and the constituencies this election. So that might shift, and maybe she can win with 2%, maybe she doesn't. In terms of the percent chance, let me just check real quick. I think Trump's up to 60% now on the prediction markets. So basically what you have here is people taking the polls and deciding that he has a 60% chance to win. Now, in terms of people influencing markets, like at the end of the day, it's a social mechanism. People are deciding to put their money where something happens. The idea, and there has been significant science research to show that over time, if you have enough diversity of interest and enough money, you will get a fairly accurate result. Now, if let's say I'm going to make something up, but let's say PolyMarket is full of crypto bros, which it might be. Although I saw something recently that crypto bros are kind of 50-50 Republican Democrat, but I would imagine they generally skew more Republican. But let's say for argument's sake, 90% of the people that used PolyMarket were Republican, then I think you lose that diversity of point of view, and I think you can get a lot of skew. I have no idea because how PolyMarket runs or if it skews Republican or anything like that. But I would say like on markets, I think we have Kamala, one second. We have Donald at 57% and Kamala at 42%. Now, I mean, they're fairly close. So Donald Trump is clearly favored in all the markets. I think that's probably a pretty accurate view of the state, even though obviously I support Kamala and not Trump. I think everybody believes this race is going to be close. The reasons I think Kamala is going to win is I think the Trump show has become really boring and tired. And, his shtick is very old. Like it was novel in 2016 and he barely won in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, who is not a very popular candidate. He got crushed by Biden in 2020 and basically has lost all the midterms. So I think like the Trump brand is kind of old. And so I think that's a big part of it. Also, women have a higher propensity to vote because of the abortion issue. I think he's going to get absolutely crushed by women on the abortion issue. And the third thing is independents generally are the decider in a lot of these elections. And I think independents, by and large, have had enough of Trump. He's old, he's angry, he divides everybody. People forget between 2016 and 2020, like Trump made everybody angry and more on edge. And I think a lot of this wokeism and Black Lives Matter and crazy like DEI initiatives and all these kinds of things, I think that was the immune system response to Trump. He kind of made everybody so crazy in the world and in the country. So I think the independents are going to go for Kamala. So I think she's going to win, but based on the numbers and the polls and the nervousness and the quote unquote Trump momentum that might be happening right now, I think people think he's got the lead, and we'll have to see. I think if you go on to smarkets.com and look at the chart, you can what I love about these markets is you can kind of get a really quick history of the race just by looking at the chart. I'm looking at the chart right now, and Kamala came out of nowhere in July and peaked when was it? She peaked September 19th, and she's at a local minimum right now. So we'll have to see if she bounces back. She was on Fox News on Wednesday night, and I thought she was great. I thought Brett Baer asked him amazing Trump talking points, and I thought she batted them down. I wish she was stronger on the immigration question. I think she could be sharper on that. But generally speaking, I thought she did great on the Fox News thing. Great. Let's wrap there. Well, thanks very much for tuning in. Please let me know in the comments if you like this format. If you have any questions, if you want me to touch on anything. As always, looking for interesting guests to come on the show. I got a lot of feedback at the G2E in Lisbon that people like the podcast. I really appreciate you guys listening to this. I know, I sound like an airline right now. I know you have your choice of podcasts. Please, thank you for choosing the Business of Betting podcast. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me. This is something I do for free. It's not part of my day job. And I do it because I believe that the industry needs more transparency, and there's a lack of sort of, I guess, discussion around what goes on behind the scenes. So thanks everybody for listening and sticking with me. And I'd love to make this better. So please send in your thoughts, questions, and have a great day, everybody. Bye.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.